Whenever we talk about the Three Gorges Dam, the conversation usually circles around the same few things, right? It's massive engineering, the sheer unimaginable weight of the water it holds back, and the catastrophic flooding that would happen if it ever failed. But in this explainer, we're going to dive into a massive blind spot in those discussions. We're looking at a hidden dimension that almost nobody mentions, yet it literally has the potential to multiply a disaster exponentially, and that is the downstream nuclear reactors. So it all starts with a really crucial question that almost no one is asking. We have multiple nuclear power facilities operating right along the 1,600-kilometer Yangtze River corridor, sitting directly downstream of the dam. Now, we all know a dam failure sends a catastrophic wall of water down that exact path. But what actually happens to a highly sensitive nuclear facility when that debris-filled floodwater reaches its front gates? Let's look at Section 1, Fukushima's technical warning, the historical precedent for flood-induced nuclear failure. To really understand the immense risk here, we don't even have to guess. We have a very direct historical precedent to look at, and that's the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi disaster. Now, it's actually a pretty common misconception that the massive earthquake destroyed the Fukushima reactors. It didn't. The reactors completely survived the quake. They were destroyed by the tsunami floodwaters that came right after. And we can directly map those exact technical failures at Fukushima onto the Three Gorges scenario. Why? Because both of these natural disasters involve massive walls of water, completely overwhelming a plant's defensive backup systems. Whether it's a coastal tsunami bringing salt water or a massive dam failure bringing freshwater inundation, the physical threat to the facility is incredibly similar. Moving to Section 2, the cooling pump vulnerability, the mechanics of decay heat and why reactors fail. This brings us to the absolute core vulnerability shared by both Fukushima and the Three Gorges scenarios, those cooling systems. To grasp the physics here, we have to talk about decay heat. You see, a nuclear reactor doesn't just turn off like a light switch. Even after you hit the emergency stop and the fission reaction completely ceases, the radioactive decay of the nuclear fuel keeps producing significant thermal energy. This decay heat requires continuous, active cooling for days, sometimes even weeks, after the reactor is officially shut down. If you lose the ability to cool that core, well, it's going to melt down. Look, cooling requires two absolute non-negotiable things. You need electricity to run massive pumps, and you need water to actually absorb and carry away the heat. At Fukushima, the external grid was lost, and their backup generators got completely submerged. At the exact same time, their water intakes were choked by tsunami debris. And a Three Gorge dam failure mirrors this perfectly. A massive flood severs external power, drowns the backup generators, and chokes the river water intakes with literally millions of tons of mud, trees, and ruined infrastructure. The pumps lose power, and even if they somehow had power, they'd have no clean water to pull from anyway. Just think about that loss of power for a second. 22,500. That is the sheer amount of megawatts of power the Three Gorges Dam provides. The very moment the dam fails, the grid instantly loses 22,500 megawatts. This triggers an immediate, massive electricity crisis, meaning the external power those downstream reactors rely on, it just vanishes in the blink of an eye. Now, of course, nuclear engineers know the grid can fail. That's exactly why these plants are equipped with massive backup diesel generators, typically designed to run the cooling pumps entirely on their own for 7 to 10 days. But here is the fatal flaw, and it's the exact technical vulnerability exposed by Fukushima. Those generators require air intakes and exhaust. If the floodwaters are high enough to reach the site and submerge those generators, they die immediately. Having 7 days of fuel means absolutely nothing if the engine is sitting underwater. So it becomes this brutal, unyielding, cascading failure. Step 1, the dam fails. Step 2, the regional grid instantly loses that 22,500 megawatts. Step 3, the sustained flood reaches the nuclear facility and submerges those backup generators. Step 4, without grid or backup tower, the vital cooling pumps fail. And Step 5, without active cooling to fight that decay heat we talked about, the core melts down. It's just a chain reaction of physics. Section 3, multiplying the disaster, the catastrophic force multiplier of radiation. Once that meltdown triggers, we enter a totally different phase of catastrophe. A dam failure on its own creates a historic humanitarian emergency along a 1,600-kilometer stretch of the Yangtze. That is a massive scale of destruction just from the water alone. We're talking millions of people displaced, infrastructure totally wiped out, and entire communities submerged. But layering a nuclear incident on top of that flood, that transforms a regional tragedy into an exponential, compounding disaster. The floodwaters would spread radioactive contamination far and wide, rendering vital agricultural land completely unusable for decades. The Yangtze, which millions upon millions rely on, would have its drinking water contaminated, not just by the heavy metals and chemicals stirred up by the flood, but by radiation. We're talking about severe public health consequences that will extend for generations.
And honestly, this creates an impossible logistical nightmare. Keep in mind, Fukushima required a 20-kilometer exclusion zone. Now imagine trying to establish a highly controlled nuclear exclusion zone in the exact same physical space as a chaotic, active flood disaster zone. It forces us to ask an impossible question. Where on earth do you evacuate people who have already been evacuated? How do you move millions of displaced, traumatized citizens who are suddenly caught inside a newly radioactive zone when all the roads and bridges have already been washed away by the dam collapse?
Which brings us to Section 4, the unspoken risk, why silence is a vulnerability. Despite this horrifying scale, the public discussion of Three Gorges risk almost never includes this nuclear dimension. Some might argue, well, the chances are too low to worry about. But the absolutely crucial point here is understanding how probability actually works in this scenario. If these were independent risks, like just a random dam failure and a random nuclear failure happening in the same year independently, sure, the odds would be practically zero, but these are heavily correlated events. The dam breaking is the exact catalyst that directly causes the flooding and the power loss that compromises the nuclear plant. If the dam fails, the probability of nuclear compromise doesn't stay low, it skyrockets. Now, China's nuclear safety regulators have presumably modeled this, but the total absence of this topic in public discourse is, in itself, an active risk factor. Because risks that aren't discussed simply aren't prepared for. You cannot effectively train local emergency responders, design evacuation protocols, or stockpile the right medical supplies for a compound disaster scenario that officials refuse to publicly acknowledge. This reality is starkly captured in our source material, which says, a dam failure is catastrophic. A dam failure plus a nuclear incident is civilizational. That really hits the nail on the head. There is a massive difference between a flood disaster that a nation can throw money and manpower at and eventually recover from in a couple decades, and a radioactive disaster that permanently poisons the soil and leaves generational scars on the land and its people. Let's just ground this comparison one final time. The harsh lesson of Fukushima is that natural disasters simply do not respect human engineering margins. And Fukushima occurred at a single facility in a wealthy country with an intact national infrastructure ready to rush in and help. The Three Gorges scenario we've mapped out today involves potential cooling pump failures at multiple nuclear facilities simultaneously, in a country whose emergency services are already fundamentally overwhelmed by one of the largest dam collapses in human history. The compounding nature of this disaster would be infinitely harder to manage.
I want to leave you with this final thought to consider. The reactors are down there. The cooling pump vulnerabilities are very real. The flood path is a direct line. Knowing this hidden compounding threat, does the nuclear angle completely change how we should view the dam's true risks? Really think about that. Because in our next explainer, we're going to pivot and explore a fascinating engineering hypothetical. If the worst did happen, could we ever actually rebuild the Three Gorges Dam? I'll see you in the next one.